The estate administrator handed me a garbage bag and said, "There's nothing of value inside." I found it on the third shelf of the bedroom closet. I am not the kind of person things happen to. I want to be clear about that before I tell you any of this, because the story sounds improbable when you say it out loud, and I've watched people's faces shift into skepticism when I get to the part about the coffee can. So I want you to understand who I was before any of this started, because that context matters. My name is irrelevant. What matters is this: I'm 44. I'm a middle school librarian at a public school in Tucson, Arizona. I make $48,000 a year before taxes, which in this city, in this decade, is the kind of salary that used to be comfortable and now just isn't. I drive a 2011 Toyota Camry with 94,000 miles on it. I have been renting the same apartment, 2 bedrooms, second floor, 1 parking spot, for 7 years, ever since my marriage ended and I divided everything we'd built together into 2 smaller, sadder piles. I had $29,000 in savings. I had worked for that $29,000 for 3 years with the specific intention of buying a house, and I had watched that goal become more distant with each passing month as the Tucson housing market did what housing markets do when a city becomes desirable and the people who already live there get left behind. My buyer's agent, a woman named Deb, who had the specific exhausted competence of someone who has shown too many houses to too many people who can't quite afford them, had shown me 22 properties over 6 months. Each one was either too expensive or too broken or both. I had started to believe, quietly and without saying it out loud to anyone, that home ownership was simply not going to happen for me. That this was one of those things in life that got classified as not for people like you, and you just had to accept that. Then Deb sent me a text on a Tuesday morning. No introduction, no explanation. Just an address and, "Don't say no until you see it." The house was on the east side of Tucson. A 2-bedroom adobe, listed at $104,000. I looked it up before I even texted her back. The listing photos were clinical and ungenerous. Someone had taken them with the functional indifference of a person who doesn't expect the property to sell quickly. What I could see: a flat-roofed adobe with cracked stucco, a yard of entirely dead vegetation, a front door painted a faded turquoise that might have once been cheerful. The interior shots showed walls of stacked newspapers and boxes and the accumulated material of a long, solitary life. The listing said, "Estate sale. Sold as is. All contents included." The previous owner was an 86-year-old man who had died 14 months ago. No known relatives. The estate had been managed by a court-appointed administrator who, according to Deb, simply wanted it off the books. The house had been vacant for over a year. "I know how it looks," Deb told me when we pulled up. She handed me a paper mask before we even got out of the car. She didn't say anything else, because she's been doing this long enough to know when a person needs a moment before they go inside. I stood at the front door for a beat. The smell reached me before the door was fully open. 14 months of vacancy and 40 years of accumulation, and something underneath both of those things that I couldn't name and chose not to analyze. The inside was extraordinary in a way that had nothing to do with beauty. Every surface was covered. Stacked newspapers formed columns along the walls, some of them chest-height. Books, hundreds of them, filled shelves and overflowed onto the floor in arrangements that suggested a system only the man himself had understood. Boxes of every size were stacked with a precision that looked almost deliberate, labeled in handwriting too small to read from a distance. The furniture underneath all of it was sturdy and plain, a man who had chosen function over comfort. He moved to Tucson in 1974. From somewhere in rural Montana, nobody in the neighborhood could say exactly where, or if they'd once known they'd forgotten. He worked as a land surveyor for the Bureau of Land Management for 22 years. He retired in 1996 and spent the following decades in near-total isolation, described by the few neighbors old enough to remember him as polite but impenetrable. He declined every invitation. He had no visitors. He received a significant amount of mail, but nobody knew from where. He paid his property taxes in cash, in person, every single year without fail. He died of natural causes, alone in this house. It took 11 days for anyone to notice. I walked through every room. It took 45 minutes. When I came back out to the front yard where Deb was waiting, I said, "I want to offer $97,000. She nodded like she'd expected it. "I'll call them today." The estate administrator accepted the same afternoon. I closed 3 weeks later. $29,000 in savings, a small renovation loan for repairs, clean title, no liens, no complications. The administrator shook my hand and handed me a key and a garbage bag and said, with the relief of a man finishing a task he'd been trying to finish for over a year, "Anything left inside is yours." We inventoried it. "There's nothing of value." I thanked him. I drove to my new house. My house, those 2 words still felt provisional in my mouth, and I sat in the driveway for a while. Then I went inside. Update 1. The cleanout. Weeks 1 to 3. I took 2 weeks off work. I rented a dumpster, one of the large ones, 12 yards, and positioned it in the driveway, and I began. I am a librarian. I have been a librarian for 19 years. A library is, among other things, an organized argument against the idea that information has no value, that context doesn't matter, that things can be discarded without first being examined. I have spent my professional life teaching 12-year-olds that you don't throw away what you haven't read. That looking carefully is its own kind of skill. That attention is something you can practice and improve. I went through every box myself. Every one. I did not hire anyone to help me, though my sister offered and Deb offered and my friend Patricia offered. I went through them alone because something about the house told me to, and I've learned, at 44, to listen to that particular kind of instinct. 80% of it was exactly what it looked like. Newspapers from the 1980s and 1990s, yellowed and brittle and filed in an order I couldn't decode. Outdated magazines, National Geographic, Sunset, Survey and Land Management Quarterly. Clothes from the 1980s, folded carefully into boxes, unworn for decades. Broken appliances. Manuals for equipment that no longer existed. The kind of material a man accumulates when he lives long enough and alone enough that discarding things starts to feel like a kind of loss. I filled the dumpster twice. But I looked at everything first. I looked at every piece of paper before it left my hands. I opened every envelope, every box, every coffee can. That last part is important. On the third day of the cleanout, on the third shelf of the bedroom closet, I found a coffee can. It was sealed with 2 rounds of electrical tape, wound with the care of someone who intended the seal to hold. It was wrapped in a 1987 issue of the Tucson Citizen and placed, with no particular attempt at concealment, next to a box of broken picture frames and a pair of work boots that had been resold at least twice. Inside the coffee can was a manila envelope. Inside the manila envelope was a warranty deed. The property described was 340 acres in Ravalli County, Montana. The deed was in the old man's name. It had been recorded in 1979, which meant he had bought this land 5 years after moving to Tucson, when he was still working for the BLM, when he was in his 40s and surveying other people's land for a living. I photographed it. I set it aside on the floor beside me. I kept going. Over the next 4 days, in locations that suggested something more deliberate than disorganization, I found more. Behind a false back in the bottom drawer of the bedroom dresser, so expertly constructed that I only found it because I pulled the drawer all the way out, a second deed, 180 acres in Custer County, Montana. Recorded 1983. Inside a hollowed-out copy of a field guide to Western Land Survey Methods, on the 4th shelf of the living room bookcase, a third deed, 640 acres in Carbon County, Wyoming. Recorded 1991. The year he was 53. In a waterproof bag tucked into the false bottom of a metal toolbox in the back of the hall closet, a 4th deed, 78 acres in Coconino County, Arizona. Recorded 2001. This one stopped my breath entirely, because Coconino County is 40 minutes from where I was standing. In the same waterproof bag, a savings account passbook from a bank in Missoula, Montana. Last entry dated 1996, the year he retired. Balance at the time, $34,400. Account number included. And underneath everything else in the bag, folded once and never unfolded again by the looks of it, a handwritten letter. Addressed to no one or to everyone, the salutation read, "To whoever finds this." The letter was 2 sentences long. I bought this land because I believed in it. I hope whoever finds it believes in it too. I sat on the floor of the empty bedroom for a long time. The afternoon light came through the window at an angle that turned the dust in the air gold. I sat with 4 property deeds and a bank passbook and 2 sentences from a man who had been dead for 14 months, and I thought about a person who trusts a coffee can more than a lawyer. More than another person. More than anything except, apparently, the ground itself. Update 2. The legal reality. Months 1 to 4. I told my sister that night. She was quiet for a long moment after I finished talking. Then she said, "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to find a probate attorney," I said. "Tomorrow." "Are you sure this is real?" "I'm a librarian," I said. "I know how to look at a primary document." I hired an attorney the following Monday. She was methodical and direct and told me, at the start of our first meeting, that this was going to be complicated and expensive and uncertain, and that I needed to understand all 3 of those things before we went any further. I appreciated that. I have learned to be suspicious of people who make hard things sound easy. The legal question was this. I had purchased the house and all its contents from the estate. The estate administrator had signed off. Clean title, no complications. But did the documents I found inside the house constitute personal property that transferred with the sale, in which case they were legally mine, or did they represent separate assets that needed to go back through probate? My attorney spent 3 weeks researching this. Her conclusion was careful and specific. The deeds themselves, as physical documents, had transferred with the household contents per the sale agreement. But the land they described required a quiet title action in each county and each state to establish my legal claim. You cannot simply possess a deed and own the land. You have to go to court, in the correct jurisdiction, and prove that no one else has a valid competing claim. 4 parcels. 3 states. 4 jurisdictions. The savings account was a separate problem entirely, requiring a probate filing in Montana. Timeline estimate, 12 to 18 months. Total cost estimate, $28,000 to $35,000. I went home and sat with that number for 3 days. I had $29,000 in savings, which I had already spent on the house. I had a renovation loan. I had a credit card with an $8,000 limit. I called my sister. I told her the number. She said, "What do you need?" That is the kind of sister she is. I said I didn't know yet. I said I'd let her know. We began the legal process in month 1. I maxed out my credit card by month 2. I stopped sleeping well by month 3. Month 3 brought the first serious complication. My Montana attorney, a careful woman in Missoula who had been doing probate and quiet title work for 26 years, found a distant relative. Second cousin, twice removed, living in Calgary, Canada. The only known living relative of a man who had spent 40 years alone in Tucson. My attorney called me on a Wednesday afternoon. I was at work, shelving returns in the 600 section. I sat down on the floor between the shelves when she told me, because my legs simply stopped cooperating. The cousin was contacted. He had never heard of the old man. Had no memory of the name, no recollection of any family connection, no interest whatsoever in land he'd never known existed. His attorney, Canadian, efficient, unbothered, communicated this clearly. He would sign a disclaimer of interest. His asking price, $5,000. My attorney negotiated. We settled at $2,000. I transferred the money without hesitation. I would have paid more. I think he sensed that and was, genuinely, not trying to take advantage of me. Or maybe he simply valued the convenience of the transaction over the theoretical worth of a claim he'd never known he had. Either way, the disclaimer was signed and filed, and one complication was resolved. Somewhere in Montana, a man had spent 40 years alone buying land, and his only living relative had never heard his name. I thought about that for a long time. I'm still thinking about it. Update 3. Complications and convergences. Months 4 to 9. Month 6. The Wyoming deed. My attorney in Cheyenne discovered a cloud on the title, a grazing lease from 1998 that had never been properly terminated. The lessee had died in 2009. His estate had never formally released the lease. The lease had simply persisted, attached to the title like a footnote nobody had bothered to remove. Resolving it required locating the records of the lessee's estate, filing a motion in Natrona County District Court, and waiting for a judge to officially terminate what had effectively been a legal ghost for 16 years. 3 months. $4,400 in additional legal fees. I borrowed $12,000 from my sister in month 7. She transferred the money without asking a single question. I told her I would pay her back. She said, "I know you will. That's not why I'm doing it." I did not sleep well for most of that year. I want to be honest about that. There is a version of this story that sounds like a smooth, inevitable ascent from struggling librarian to something else, and that version is false. The reality was 14 months of genuine uncertainty, of lying awake calculating legal fees against income against the possibility that the whole thing would fall apart at one of 100 different junctures. The second cousin in Calgary could have contested instead of disclaimed. The Wyoming cloud could have involved a living lessee. Any one of the 4 quiet title actions could have surfaced a competing claim I hadn't anticipated. I kept going because I am a librarian and librarians finish what they start. Month 9 brought something I had not anticipated, though perhaps I should have. My Arizona attorney called on a Thursday morning. The 78 acres in Coconino County, the parcel 40 minutes from my house, the one the old man had bought in 2001 for reasons I will never fully understand, were adjacent to land owned by a solar energy development company that had been quietly and methodically acquiring Coconino County acreage for the past 2 years. They wanted to talk. I knew what that meant before my attorney finished the sentence. Capital moves toward land the way water moves toward low ground, not with malice, not with particular intention, just with the patient, structural inevitability of a thing that is larger than the things in its way. They weren't villains. They were simply a company that had identified a region of Arizona as strategically valuable for solar development and had begun the process of assembling the acreage they needed. The old man had bought 78 acres in 2001 for $31,000. I know that because the deed of sale was in the same envelope as the deed itself. He kept his records in his way. He held that land for 23 years without telling anyone it existed. I held it for 9 months and a solar company was already calling. My attorney told them we would be in touch when the quiet title action was complete. They said they understood. They were very polite about it. I imagine they are always very polite. Month 11 brought the last piece. The savings account in Missoula, $34,400, last active in 1996, had, after 28 years of inactivity, been transferred to Montana's unclaimed property fund. This is standard procedure. Dormant accounts move to state custody after a certain period. The original owner or their heirs can claim them. I filed a claim through my Montana attorney. The process required establishing my legal standing as the recipient of the estate's personal property, submitting documentation of the account's existence, and waiting for Montana's Department of Revenue to process the claim. It was approved in month 11. Balance, with 28 years of accrued interest, $41,200. The old man had left a savings account in Missoula with enough money to represent, in 1996, several months of modest living. He had retired and walked away from it. He had put his money into land instead. Into the ground, patient and permanent, where it would wait for someone who was paying attention. Update 4. Resolution. Months 12 to 14. All 4 quiet title actions were completed by month 14. I held clear title to 340 acres in Ravalli County, Montana. Agricultural land with a creek that runs cold even in summer, assessed at $680,000. 180 acres in Custer County, Montana. Grazing land, open and flat, assessed at $290,000. 640 acres in Carbon County, Wyoming. Mixed-use rangeland, the largest of the 4 parcels, assessed at $1,120,000. 78 acres in Coconino County, Arizona, assessed, before the solar company's involvement, at somewhere between $800,000 and $1.1 million. After the solar company's involvement, considerably more. They made a formal offer of $2,200,000. My attorney negotiated. She is very good at her job, and she had spent 14 months watching me borrow money and lose sleep over this, and I think she took a certain professional satisfaction in the negotiation. Final sale price, $2,650,000. Closed in escrow on a Tuesday in October, which was a day I had to teach a research skills class to 38th graders, and I taught it, and I came home and sat in my car in the driveway of a house I owned and cried for 20 minutes before I went inside. I did not sell the Montana and Wyoming land. Not yet. I don't know if I ever will. Instead, I leased the grazing rights on all 3 parcels to a ranching family in Billings, a couple in their 50s who had been ranching the same region for 30 years and who, when my attorney contacted them, were so matter-of-fact about the arrangement that I found it steadying. $38,000 annually. Passive income. Clean and quiet, the way the old man would have wanted. I paid off my legal fees. Every dollar, every jurisdiction. I paid my sister $180,000. She cried. I cried. We sat at her kitchen table and drank coffee and didn't talk about the old man, but we were both thinking about him. She had lent me $12,000 without asking a question. I gave her back 15 times that. Some debts are larger than money and can only be paid in kind. I paid off the renovation loan and the credit card. I put $400,000 into a conservative investment account managed by a financial advisor who spent our first meeting asking me careful questions about risk tolerance and long-term goals and seemed genuinely unbothered by the unusual provenance of the assets. I had $1,900,000 remaining. Update 5. What comes after? Months 14 to 18. I did not quit my job. I want to be clear about that, because it seems like the expected ending. Woman discovers hidden wealth. Woman leaves her modest life behind. Everything transforms. That is not what happened. What happened is more ordinary and, I think, more true. I took a leave of absence. 1 year. I had earned it, in the most literal sense of that phrase. I spent the first week of it doing almost nothing, which was its own kind of revelation. I had not understood how tired I was until the exhaustion finally had space to announce itself. In June, I drove to Montana. I drove because I wanted the distance to be real. 1,400 miles from Tucson to Ravalli County, through the desert and up through Utah and into the long mountains of western Montana. I stopped at a gas station outside of Missoula and thought about the old man going into a bank here in 1996 and opening an account and putting his retirement savings into it and then apparently never returning. What was he thinking? What had changed? I don't know. I will never know. That incompleteness is something I have made my peace with, mostly. The 340 acres in Ravalli County are grassland, with pine at the edges and a creek that cuts through the southeast corner, cold and clear even in June, running over pale stones. I parked at the edge of the property and walked it for 3 hours. There are no structures on it. No fences, no improvements. Just land that a man bought in 1979 and held for 45 years while he lived alone in a house in Tucson, paying his property taxes in cash every year without fail. I stood in the middle of it for a long time. The sky in western Montana in June is a particular shade of blue that seems too large for the eyes, and the grass moved in a wind I could feel before I could hear. I had no idea what to do with this land. I still don't, entirely. But I understood, standing there, something about why a person would spend their life acquiring it and then hide the evidence of that acquisition in a coffee can. The ground doesn't leave. The ground doesn't change what it is. The ground requires nothing from you except that you pay attention to it, show up occasionally, and trust that it will still be there when you do. On my second day in Missoula, I found the BLM office where the old man had worked for 22 years. The building itself had changed, expanded, modernized, but the survey department was still there, and an archivist named Don had been working in that building since 1989. He remembered the old man. Not well, it had been nearly 30 years, but the way you remember someone who was reliably, quietly present for 2 decades and then one day simply wasn't. He was very precise, Don told me. We were standing in the parking lot. He'd come out to smoke and had started talking when I mentioned the old man's name. The kind of surveyor who made other surveyors look approximate. He had a gift for it. For reading land. I asked if he knew why the old man had moved to Tucson. Don thought about it. I think it was a relationship that didn't work out. Before my time. But that was the story. He came out here from somewhere rural, the eastern part of the state, maybe, and something happened and he ended up in Tucson instead. He came back to survey every summer for years. Stayed in the same motel. Ate at the same diner. I don't think he ever really left, in his mind. He took a drag of his cigarette. He loved land the way some people love people. He just didn't know how to do both at the same time. I drove back to Tucson in 4 days. I stopped at the Wyoming parcel on the way back and stood on it for an hour. 640 acres of mixed rangeland, flat at the center and rising toward hills at the northern boundary. The ranching family's cattle were on it already, small dark shapes moving slowly at the far edge. It looked like it was being used. That seemed right. I went back to work in September. Not because I had to, I want to be honest about that. I never have to work again, if I make reasonable choices about money, which I intend to do. I went back because I wanted to. Because I am a librarian and I like libraries, and I like the particular quality of silence in a room full of people reading, and I like the moment when a 12-year-old who has never thought of research as anything but homework suddenly understands that a library is a machine for finding things out, and their face changes. I like that moment. Money doesn't improve it. Money can't give you that. I did negotiate, for the first time in my life, for a better salary. I got it. The renovation on the house took 5 months and came in slightly under budget, which my contractor seemed personally offended by, as though he'd been hoping for a dramatic overrun. The adobe is good now, solid and clean, with new plumbing and refinished floors and stucco in a color I chose myself that is a more honest version of the turquoise the front door used to be. The yard is planted with native species, desert willow, brittlebush, 2 young saguaros that will outlive me by a century if I've planted them correctly. The house is mine in a way that feels different from how anything has ever been mine before. Not because of what I paid for it or what I found inside it. Because I went through it inch by inch, alone, and I know its bones. I know the 3rd shelf of the bedroom closet. I know the hollow in the dresser drawer. I know the careful false bottom of the metal toolbox. I know where he hid things. In the living room, I built one shelf deliberately bare. I leave it empty. On it I have placed a single coffee can, sealed with 2 rounds of electrical tape, the way I found it. There is nothing inside it. It is there to remember. Reflection. People ask me what I would have done if I hadn't found the coffee can. If I had hired a clean-out crew like everyone suggested. If I had thrown away the boxes without looking. If I had been the kind of person who moves through the world at a pace that doesn't allow for 3rd shelves and false bottoms and hollowed-out survey manuals. I don't like that version of the story, so I don't spend time in it. What I think about instead is a man who moved to Tucson in 1974 from somewhere in rural Montana, carrying something he'd lost and something he believed in. He surveyed other people's land for 22 years and, at the same time, quietly and without telling anyone, bought parcels of his own, in the county he came from, in the states adjacent to the places he'd worked, in the desert he'd made his home. He put the deeds in a coffee can. He put the coffee can on the third shelf of his bedroom closet. He lived alone for 40 years and died alone in his house, and it took 11 days for anyone to notice, and when the estate administrator inventoried everything, he found nothing of value. He was looking for furniture and jewelry. He wasn't looking for a coffee can on the third shelf. Not everyone looks at the third shelf. Not everyone has been trained to. The old man left 2 sentences for whoever came after him. He hoped they believed in the land the way he did. I didn't know anything about land when I found that letter. I know more now. I own more now, though own feels like an imprecise word for what I have, which is stewardship of 1,160 acres across 2 states, held by a ranching family who knows how to use it, earning money every month from the simple fact of ground being ground. I stood on his 340 acres in Montana in June, and I understood, maybe for the first time, why a person would put everything they trusted into the ground instead of into people. The ground doesn't leave. The ground doesn't disappoint you. The ground doesn't die, not in any time frame that matters to a person. It just waits, patient and permanent, for someone who is paying attention to show up. I showed up. I paid attention. I looked at the third shelf. I am still, after everything, most essentially a librarian, a person whose professional identity is built around the conviction that looking carefully is worth it. That things have context. That before you throw something away, you should know what it is. He trusted a coffee can. He trusted the ground. He left 2 sentences for a stranger and hoped for the best. I keep the can on the shelf to remember that trust is sometimes sealed with electrical tape and placed where only someone paying attention will find it. I keep it to remember a man whose name I know and whose life I don't, who loved land the way some people love people, and who, somewhere between the BLM office in Missoula and a house on the east side of Tucson, ran out of road for both. He left me the land. I left it the way he left it, patient and in good hands and waiting. That's the whole story.